Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring villains. The Scapegoat by Richard Maples. Next Stop Nowhere by Dick Purcell. Firegod by Algis Budrys. Even Stephen by Charles A. Stearns. Go to Sleep, My Darling by Winston K. Marks. The Scapegoat by Richard Maples, originally published in Galaxy Science Fiction, June 1956. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Who would not have pity for a poor, helpless victim? Nobody, except another poor victim. The old guy didn't have a chance. All he could do was shield his head with limp arms and moan, while this other fellow, a young, husky 6-footer, gave him a vicious, cold-blooded beating. "Hey there!" I yelled indignantly. "Cut it out!" But the kid kept belting away, as if he were methodically working out on a 50-pound training bag. Finally, the old man sagged to the pavement. Then this hoodlum began to kick him. I'm not a hero. I'm a newspaper man whose job it is to look at things objectively, but I know right from wrong. My one punch caught the young bruiser back of the ear and spilled him on the ground. He lay there for a moment, then rolled over. Even by the streetlight it was easy to see his eyes were glassy. It gave me lots of satisfaction. I'm not a big man, just compact, but I take care of myself. I don't drink or smoke, and I exercise regularly. The result is I can handle myself in the clinches. The kid sat up and pushed himself unsteadily to his feet. I could see now that he was a college boy. The red sweater with a terry cloth border and the white pants with a shortened left leg were a dead giveaway. "Listen here," I said roughly. "You nuts, beating up an old man." He appeared to be desperately searching for an explanation, something to say. Then, abruptly, without having uttered a sound, he reeled away and shambled hurriedly down the street. My first inclination was to give chase, but the old man groaned and I turned to help him. That was when I had it, a virtual brainstorm. This whole episode, I could see, was a perfect answer to the damnable criticism levelled at my series on juvenile delinquency. More than that, it was an absolute vindication. Barely an hour ago, I'd had to sit at a meeting and take it on the chin from 20 of the town's leading lights who designated themselves the Committee for the Protection of Youth. The outfit was, of course, politically inspired. It had obviously been started by the mayor and his gang as a means of torpedoing Jones, the publisher of my paper. Jones, you see, had become politically ambitious himself. Since I was the star on Jones's team, they piled on me. Some of the nicer things said about my articles were that they constituted filthy muckraking, were a pattern of irresponsible lies, and were designed principally to smear the incumbent politicos. The children of the town, they cried, were being sacrificed to ruthless ambition. It wouldn't have been so bad if Jones had stuck by me, but he cut and ran. Discretion, he had whispered to me from behind a pudgy hand, was the better part of valour. Then he told them he would discontinue the articles. Now I had first-hand proof of a particularly brutal bit of delinquency, a cruel assault on a poor helpless old man. Furthermore, I was the hero of the incident. Bending down to see how seriously the old man had been hurt, I asked, "What happened, Pop? Was he trying to rob you or something?" He didn't answer. I looked around for help, but the street was deserted. The best thing, I decided, was to take him home. There Nan, my wife, could patch him up while I found out what had happened. I bent down again and pulled him to his feet. He staggered. I put one steadying hand on his shoulder and gripped his wrist with the other. My spine went cold. It was his flesh. Not so much that it felt like rubber, but the chill. Here we were in the middle of a heat wave, the thermometer nudging 90, and the old guy's wrist is like an icicle. For a second it threw me. Then I thought of shock. That might explain it, and Nan, having been a nurse, would be the one to know. I started the old man walking. "See if you can make it to my house," I urged. "It's just around the corner." Nan switched on the porch light when she heard us on the steps. Opening the door, she drew back with a little shriek. The old man was pretty gruesome looking at that, but it wasn't just his blood-covered face and matted white beard. There was something spiderish about him. He was angular and dark and skeletal. His eyes, deep-set and brooding, seemed to crouch under his shagging, jutting brows. "Take it easy, honey," I said. "The old guy just needs some patching up." She recovered quickly and helped him into the house. After we'd eased him into the easy chair by the fireplace in the living room, she turned to me, worried. "Were you in an accident?" I gave her the story, and she looked at me sharply, but didn't speak. She went into the bedroom and came back with blankets and medicine bottles. Tucking the blankets around the old man's legs, she said, "But I don't understand why you were walking. You went to the meeting in Jones's car. Why didn't he bring you back?" I didn't answer. The old man had closed his eyes, and his breathing was becoming very shallow. "Look at him," I said. "Is he all right?" "He's sleeping. Why don't you answer my question?" Jones didn't bring me home because I had words with him and walked away in a huff. "Over the meeting?" "Partly." I explained about the meeting and how Jones had backtracked when the going got rough. After all, it was his idea to build circulation with sensational articles and to use them to attack the present administration. But when there's a show done, he acts like a scared rabbit. And that's what I told him. "I'm glad," Nan said, her face brightening. "What did he say to that?" "He gave me a lot of bull about it being a mistake to pick on people's children, and how we should stick to old standbys like red light districts and dope trafficking." Nan slapped the iodine on the table. "Some nerve! What did you tell him?" I told him he was jerking the rug from under me, and that I'd be damned if I'd write a bunch of warmed-over tripe. Then I walked away. "You finally quit!" Until then, I don't think I'd ever realized just how much Nan hated my work. Of course, off and on, we'd really had some knockdown drag-outs, but I'd never considered them serious. We'd often talked about my going into teaching physical ed. It had been my intention ever since college. Some day I'd actually do it. I shook my head. "No, honey, I didn't quit." "But you're going to?" I shrugged in a gesture of helplessness. How can I? An unprovoked attack against a poor old man is dynamite. It puts me in the driver's seat. I can write an article that will make every mealy-mouthed hypocrite who spoke against me tonight eat his words. The fire in her eyes died. "It's always something," she said wearily. "Year after year, you've come up with one reason or another to stay in that rotten business. And what does it amount to? Mudslinging. I'm beginning to think you like it." She had never come out so bluntly. And deep down, I felt my resentment pressing like the sharp edge of a coiled spring. Originally, getting into the newspaper game had been a sort of fluke. Majoring in physical ed at college, I often covered the various sports events for the campus paper. One day, a big-time scandal broke, involving gamblers and one of the teams, and I found myself in a perfect spot to do an exclusive for a city paper. My stuff was run verbatim under a byline, and afterward picked up by the wire services. Later, with a trick knee help keeping me out of the war, I managed to talk myself into a job with a newspaper that had run my expose. I was goaded by a feeling that I ought to be doing something bigger than teaching children how to play games. From the very start, I discovered I had a peculiar talent. If I found myself anywhere near a skeleton in the closet, I could plainly hear its rattle. Before long, my reputation was firmly established. Nan, whom I had met at college, knew of my ambition to teach, and began planning towards that end as soon as we married. She started what she called a quitting fund. This was to stake a move to a small town where her uncle was principal of the high school. He was supposed to help me get a foothold in the new career. But then Tommy was born, and there were bills to pay. After that there were other reasons, like car payments. By the end of the war, the teaching plans were no longer discussed, and Nan and I had drawn so far apart that even the bickering between us had ceased. Finally, when Tommy was about 10, she suddenly let me have it. It seems the kid was running around with a tough crowd. She wanted to get him away from the city. He needed the fresh air and the decent normal home life of a small town, she said, and she meant every word of it. Luckily, Jones had come along right about then and offered me a job on his newspaper back in the old hometown. He had an idea he could drive the opposition paper out of business by featuring yellow journalism at the local level. That's where I came in. With my ability to make the news bleed, he figured he could cinch it. For that reason, he was willing to double my present salary. So I accepted. Nan, of course, was furious, even though I pointed out the extra dough meant we could start planning again. She didn't calm down until I promised to quit the job after 6 months. Yes, it was always something. She was right enough about that. But she had no right to make such an issue of things. I started to tell her that, then stopped. Maybe she was picking a quarrel to make me forget about the old man and the story. I threw a fast block into my resentment. "Honey," I said, "don't be unreasonable. Remember, this job with Jones was supposed to get Tommy away from the city, and the extra dough was all part of that big plan for the teaching business." "What plan?" she flared. "There never was a plan except to pamper your vanity. Big-shot Potter, the whiz-bang newspaper man. That's all you've ever been interested in." I had to take a deep breath to keep from yelling back at her. "You're not being very fair about this. I did it all with you and Tommy in mind." Her voice lowered. "Is that so? Well, how about the promise to quit in 6 months? We've saved the money. What marvellous thing do you have in mind for me and Tommy now?" That hurt. As a matter of fact, I've been quite enjoying this stint with Jones. My series on juvenile delinquency had just about doubled the circulation, and that gave me a deep sense of accomplishment. Then, too, writing this stuff against the mayor and the rest of the town's bigwigs, in keeping with Jones' political ambitions, nurtured a feeling of power that was very satisfying. Frankly, the meeting earlier that evening had set me down harder than I cared to admit. Now, with every chance for a comeback, Nan wanted me to pass. "Listen," I snarled, "so it's hot, so don't take it out on me." Her fists bunched, and the colour drained from her face. Knowing the signs, I could tell this was going to be a Lulu. But the door flew open, and Tommy came clumping through the hallway and into the front room. He's a big kid for his age, mentally and physically. He spotted the old man right away. "Golly!" he breathed excitedly. "Who's the creep?" "Never mind," Nan said quickly, recovering her composure. "He's had an accident. Just get some money from your father and go to the drugstore for more bandages. I'll need them." I gave him $1, and he ran out the kitchenway, slamming the back door so hard the whole house shook. The old man's eyes flickered open. He looked at me first, then at Nan. "Well," he said in a peculiar, muffled tone that suggested that he was speaking through an obstruction like a fencing mask, "isn't this cosy?" I immediately threw a lot of questions at him. His name, he said, was Ash. Just plain Ash. He couldn't remember any other name. He couldn't remember why he'd been beaten up, nor what had led up to it. He was very confused. He thought maybe it would all come back to him later. However, he did remember my rescuing him, and he appreciated that very much. Hearing him say so gave me a nice tingling glow. I invited him to stay for dinner, and he accepted. Nan objected. "There's only salad," she wailed. "It was too hot to cook." "Salad's fine," I told her. "Oh, Ted, please." "Listen here," I said coldly. "I've invited Ash to stay, and he's accepted. Why all the fuss?" She gave me a hurt look, turned, flounced into the kitchen. I started to follow, thinking I'd made a mistake in being so brusque. Then I thought, the heck with it. Let her take it any way she wanted. Sweat was plastering my shirt and pants to me like a skin diver's outfit. I needed a shower. I told Ash to rest easy and went into the bathroom. When I came out, Tommy had returned. He and the old man were busily gabbing. Nan, standing by the kitchen door, frantically signalled me to join her. In the kitchen, she backed me against the sink. "Get him out of here!" "Why?" I asked, startled. "There's something wrong with him." "Wrong? He gives me the willies." "It's just the heat," I scoffed. "If you must know, he leered at me while you were in the shower. It was awful." "Nan, do you think that kind of yarn is going to stop me from writing about what happened tonight?" "It won't, and you can make up your mind I'm keeping the job. When I get through with the people in this town, they'll know they've been dealing with Edward Potter." Tight-lipped, she went to the refrigerator for the supper. As soon as we'd sat down, Ash began to talk. He kept it up through the entire meal. He'd been everywhere and done everything, to hear him tell it. Tommy, listening bug-eyed, kept asking questions. It sort of got me. The hero of the affair, to my own son, was Ash. It was Nan who finally blew the whistle. "Mr. Ash," she said, her voice honed to a razor edge, "I'm sure Ted would be much more interested in knowing what led up to the fight tonight, or are you still confused?" There was a beat of 3 while he studied Nan carefully. Then he said, "It's quite apparent, Miss Potter, that you're absolutely no use for me. This shows discernment. Most likely, with a woman's instinct, you've hit upon at least part of the truth. Because of that, it might be wise to lay all my cards on the table, but I warn you, it will be hard to believe." "That," said Nan, leaning back with a gleam of triumph in her eyes, "I'll bet on." It was hard to believe, all right. So hard, in fact, that I thought he was just pulling Nan's leg. He said he'd come from another world, outside our solar system, where people existed in a kind of liquid state, bouncing about, for the most part like large water-filled bladders. They were, however, capable of taking almost any shape their superior minds willed. They could flatten and drift about in the water, or they could inflate and rise in the air. They could even become facsimiles of other living things, taking on the shape, texture, and coloration, a capability which aided greatly in their main function of travelling as missionaries of goodness among the peoples of the galaxy. For they were perfect as angels. As he talked, Nan's face got redder and redder. Finally, when I couldn't keep from snickering, she jumped up, grabbed her empty plate, and headed for the kitchen. "Don't rush off, honey," I said innocently. She stopped at the kitchen door and glared at me. "I guess I know when I'm being kidded." "But," as Ash said in his cold, dry purr, "I'm not kidding." It seemed to me the joke had gone on far enough. "Don't tell me," I said sarcastically, "that you're a missionary to Earth." "No," he admitted. "I'm here because I was banished." "Oh, a sort of fallen angel." "Exactly." Another chill scurried along my spine. It was his tone of voice more than anything. But then, too, his eyes had a dull, black humorlessness about them. Nan returned to the table and sat down. I noticed a band of perspiration moustaching her upper lip. Indeed, I seem to have grown much hotter myself. Irritably I said, "Ash, it's too damn warm for games. If you don't want to explain what's happened this evening, that's your privilege. But as you know, the story means a lot to me, and I did stick my neck out for you." He held up a gnarled hand. "One moment, my boy. Let me finish." So he finished, and the rest of the story was even nuttier. He was a throwback, he said with quiet pride. The perfection which had taken his people countless years to attain was wiped out the moment he came into being. They tried to reform him, but there was something fundamental about his evil, as if it were an essence. As a last resort, they'd put him into one of the wonderful machines and thrown the switch. At that agonizing instant, he'd imagined himself to be water scraping over the edge of a sharp rock. Then he'd come to, drifting through space. And much later, he'd touched Earth. Once landed, he'd taken on many shapes through the years, mainly, however, of people who'd died. Even as he talked, I was carefully sliding my chair back. If I could reach the phone in the hallway without being noticed, it would be fairly simple to get help. But he saw what I was doing and laughed. "Edward," he said, "I know you don't believe me, but stick around until I prove it." What happened next almost made me sick to my stomach. His face, which had been wrinkled as a fielder's mitt, all of a sudden took on the appearance of a disturbed reflection in a pool of water. His flesh began to writhe like a tangled mass of earthworms. 30 seconds after it began, he'd sloughed off 30 years. Even his beard, which had been as white as shower-room tiling, became a fierce dead black. I heard Tommy pipe, "Golly!" and Nan sigh, only it sounded more like a groan. I shook away the dazed feeling, and it was immediately replaced by a great excitement. "Listen here," I said hoarsely. "This story will set the whole country on its ear, with my byline on it." "Oh, Ted," Nan cried, "don't let him take you in. It's a trick. It's mass hypnotism or something." "The trouble with you," I said, "is you don't even believe even what you see with your own eyes." The next day I went to see Jones. We'd decided, Ash and I, upon a course of action. The existence of Ash was to remain a secret, but I was to keep my job with the paper at all costs. When we could sit back and wait for the opportune moment to spill it, a time when we had the best angle and were positive Ash wouldn't be labelled as a hoax. Driving to the plant, I was tense enough to snap. It was not entirely from the unabated heat either. I didn't like the way Ash had acted during the latter part of the evening. Naturally, I had felt disappointment at not being able to reveal his presence. But what rankled most was the guy's colossal gall. Okay, so I'm childish, only I just don't like to have someone gobble up my share of the dessert. He'd also borrowed all the cash in the house and then demanded I draw on my bank account. I quickly discouraged that, but the topper was his forcing Nan and me to sleep on the couch while he used the bed. He said his bruises still hurt, even though they weren't visible. My mood didn't improve when Jones kept me waiting for over an hour. Surprisingly enough, he was in good spirits. As I entered the office, he indicated one of the leather chairs and said with a laugh, "Sit down, Ted. I've got some good news." My opinion of him the previous evening obviously hadn't been taken very much to heart. Sourly I told him, "As a publisher, you should know that good news is no news." The smile left his face. Then, with a visible effort, he forced it back. "You have something there, Ted. You certainly have. But point of view is important also. You see, they've arrested a gang of kids for shoplifting. One of them is Tommy, your son." I jumped up. "Arrested Tommy?" "Now wait, Ted. Don't go off all half-cocked. It's a break. Don't you see? You can cover delinquency with the lid off now. You'll be writing as a parent in the same boat with other parents." I could still hear his frantic noises after I slammed the door behind me and run the length of the corridor. At the police station, I had a distinct feeling they'd been waiting for me. I knew most of them, especially the big red-headed guy who'd beckoned me into the rear office. His name was Thompson, Detective Emmanuel Thompson. He always looked as if he wore a football uniform under his dark blue suit. My articles had roasted him plenty. He handled juvenile delinquency cases. "Well, Mr. Potter," he greeted me, smiling tightly, "we meet under unfortunate circumstances." "Can the phony sympathy," I said. "You're not the type. Just let me see my boy." He used a red and blue handkerchief to wipe the dampness from his beefy neck. "I think we'd better have a little talk first." "I got no talking to do. This is a lousy frame-up against me and the paper. Get my son out of here and do it fast." He put the handkerchief away, sighed, and reached for the phone. It really got me when Tommy came into the room. He had been crying. His face was streaked, and he looked scared and forlorn. "Son," I said, finding it difficult to keep the rasp out of my voice, "if you've got a hat, put it on and let's go." Thompson pulled out his handkerchief again and carefully lowered himself into the chair behind the desk. "You don't seem to understand, Mr. Potter. Your boy is in trouble. He's been identified as leading a gang of kids who spent most of the morning shoplifting in stores all over town." "That's bull," I said. "How could my boy do a thing like that? He's only 12. Who identified him anyway?" "The shopkeepers and the other members of the gang." For one awful moment I felt a great cavity of doubt. "Son," I asked, "what's all this about?" Tommy's face creased with fear and tears brimmed his eyes. "It was Ash," he quavered. "Ash?" "Yes. I told him about the gang." "Gang?" "The Red Skulls." "What the heck are you talking about?" "Some of the fellows got together and built a hut for a clubhouse over on the garbage dump. We call ourselves the Red Skulls. I was made leader. I'm called the Skullcap." "Why haven't I heard about this?" "You never asked, Dad. I tried to tell you one night, but you were hurrying to get that roadhouse on the turnpike. You said you had a big lead on juvenile delinquency." "Well, you certainly didn't try very hard," I said angrily. "What was this gang's purpose?" "Oh, different things. One of the fellows has a .22, and we hunt rats. Then—" "Go on." "That's all." "You started to say something else." He kicked at the floor. "Oh, gee." "Let's have it." "We smoked." "Smoked?" He nodded. "And what else?" "That's all, honest." Thompson said, "What about shoplifting?" "No," snivelled Tommy. "That was Ash. He wanted me to talk the gang into shoplifting, but I wouldn't. Then he changed himself to look like me and talked the fellows into it when I wasn't around. I only know about it because I ran into them after they'd been in a store." Thompson gave me a funny look. "Who's this Ash he keeps talking about?" I started to tell him. Then I got a sudden mental flash of how idiotic it would all sound. "The boy," I said evenly, "is beside himself because of all he's been through. It's time to call a halt to this farce. I'm going to hire myself some legal talent." He shrugged. "Suit yourself." Tommy grabbed my arm and cried, "Please don't leave me, Dad." I pulled away from him, feeling as if I'd dropped him off a cliff. Right outside the station I met Nan. She was pale and breathless. Jones had phoned the news. She wanted to go to Tommy immediately. I guided her to the car and pushed her inside. "Listen here," I said tensely. "For once, don't make a fuss. Just help me find Ash. He's the one who can free Tommy." She began to laugh. "That's a hot one," she gasped. "That's really a hot one." I shook her, thinking she was hysterical. She stopped laughing and swallowed hard. "Ash is home." "Home?" "Blind drunk, with a brand on his knee." I tramped so hard on the accelerator that it must have scraped the ground all the way home. Ash didn't hear me pull up to the house because the radio was going full blast. I hit the light switch in the hallway, and the brightness flared against the lengthening afternoon shadows, spotting him and the blonde on the living room couch. The blonde looked as if she'd come from a burlesque runway. Ash dumped her on the floor and staggered to his feet. He'd changed his appearance again. Now he looked a strikingly handsome 25. He came forward to throw a heavy arm around my shoulder. "Glad to see you, Ted," he mouthed. "Ran out of money. Must have more. Small loan." I put both hands on his chest and pushed. He stumbled back and thudded against the wall. "The police have picked up Tommy," I said flatly. "He's been charged with the shoplifting you did today." He sobered instantly. He jerked the blonde to her feet, booted her out, slammed the door, and came back to me. "Ted, I'm shocked to hear this. Tell me about it quickly. We must do something right away." The blonde had begun to howl and scream curses. I could hear doors and windows opening all the way down the street. "You monster!" Nan spat and hurried outside. Presently the girl quieted down. "Ted," Ash whispered, "I'm ashamed of myself. Here you befriended me, and all I've done is get you and your family in trouble." He held a cupped hand over his eyes as if he were shading tears. "Can you possibly find it in your heart to forgive me?" I was moved. After all, a poor homeless alien being couldn't very well be expected to understand our manners and feelings. Yet this one did. All because he'd been touched by my friendship. "Ash," I said, feeling the warmth of goodwill. "I'm happy to hear you say that. Bygones are bygones. The important thing is springing Tommy." "Exactly," he said. "We'll go and explain everything to the police. But we'll do it in grand style. This is your big show. We must have Jones and the mayor. We must have photographers, reporters, television, radio, everything." Nan returned. "The girl will be all right. She was just upset." "Honey," I told her excitedly, "we're about to stand the whole country on its collective ear. Ash is going to reveal his identity." Nan's face pinched into a look of disgust. "You mean you're trusting this creature again?" "Sure, honey. Anyone can make a mistake." "That's right," she exploded. "You're making one now. Oh, Ted, stop being such a fool." "Listen here," I said. "This is the last 2 minutes of the game. We're trying to score before the gun, and you start an argument." She began to blubber. Why must she always be so unreasonable? Why the constant bickering and tension and unhappiness? I was sick to death of it. I grabbed Ash's arm. "Come on," I said. "Let's go." Even outdoors, the air felt hot and clammy. I headed the car for the plant, figuring I could do my phoning from there as well as pick a crew. But on Main Street, Ash spotted a cab and made me stop. He said he'd better go on ahead. He thought things would work smoother that way. He could start the ball rolling on the release of Tommy, and I wouldn't be held up by having to tell people who he was. I drove on alone, but it was a mistake. People simply didn't believe my story about an alien being. In various ways and tones of voice, they all suggested I go home and sleep it off. In desperation, I went up to Jones's house, even though he'd already told me on the phone that he was in the middle of a dinner party. He came up close to me and sniffed my breath. "Don't worry," I told him. "I never touch it. But maybe I should smell yours. Anyone who turns his back on the biggest story of all time must be drunk." He jerked the cigar from his mouth and gave me a narrow-eyed, searching look. "Ted, I just hope for your sake this isn't some kind of a joke." 15 minutes later, we pulled up to the police station in a 3-car convoy with a big crew from the paper. I led the group inside, feeling the excitement grow in me. I marched up to the desk sergeant. "Where is he?" The desk sergeant looked startled. "Who?" Well, he wasn't there. He just wasn't there. It was like getting tackled 2 yards from a touchdown by a tackler you hadn't realized was anywhere near. Jones pushed forward, chewing agitatedly on his cigar. "Edward, You've got some nerve putting a stunt like this. It's an outrage." "Take it easy," I said weakly. "Something's gone wrong." "It certainly has. You must have gone insane." "Listen here, if you don't stick with me on this, I'm all through with the paper." "That suits me fine." I watched him leave, trailing cigar smoke. The others followed. My face burned and sweat trickled down my back and along my sides. I wanted to hit out at something. A hand gripped my elbow. It was Sergeant Thompson. "Mr. Potter, you shouldn't let this get you down. People's kids get in scrapes all the time. Tomorrow you'll have a talk with the judge and everything will turn out okay." I jerked my elbow away. "In other words, you think I'm batty too." "No," he said, gripping my elbow again and starting me toward the door. "It's been hot, and you just need some rest." "Thompson," I said, dragging myself to a halt, "I know it sounds nuts, but this Ash character really exists. Help me find him and you can cut yourself a slice. It'll be big time." The grip on my elbow increased. "Go home, Mr. Potter, and get a good night's sleep." "But it's on the level, Thompson. Jones and I busted up. I'm playing on your team now." His face got all flushed. "My job isn't a game and I don't belong to any team. Get wise, will you? Stay in your own backyard for once. It could stand a lot of weeding." He pushed me out the door then, so hard I almost fell. Standing there, feeling the heat press in on me, I tried to dope out the next move. My car was still at Jones's place, so I'd need a cab. I turned toward the drugstore at the end of the block where I could phone. Walking along, I recalled Ash had taken a cab earlier in the evening. If I could talk to the driver, I might get a lead on his whereabouts. I walked faster. I thought of Thompson and his remark about the backyard. And the weeds. Again, for the third time, a chill travelled the length of my spine. I began to run. I ran past the drugstore and all the way home. They were both in the bedroom. Nan stood in the far corner with her back against the wall. Her shoulders were scratched and her lip cut. She held a heavy bookend poised to strike at Ash, who was in front of her, moving stealthily forward. The moment I spun him around, I froze in amazement. I couldn't recognize him. Then, all at once, I realized I was looking at the spitting image of myself. He broke from my grasp and darted to the window. Before I could follow, Nan had dropped the bookend and flung herself into my arms. "Oh, Ted," she sobbed, "I knew it wasn't you." I kissed her and gently disengaged her arms. "I've got to get Ash," I said. When I vaulted through the window and circled the house, I spotted him rushing down the street. I caught him around the corner at the same spot where I'd first seen him. I slugged him, yet I knew it was useless the instant the blow landed. He felt just like sponge rubber, but I kept hitting him. I didn't bother listening to his cries, and I didn't give a damn that he'd changed himself back to an old man. The blow on the back of my neck was so sudden I didn't feel it. The only sensation was unbalance, as if I was walking uphill. Then I was slapped with the sidewalk. Looking up, I could see he was young, clean-cut, and well-built. His long, horsey face was furious. "You crazy?" he yelled. "Beating up an old man?" I searched desperately for an explanation, something to say. Then abruptly, without having uttered a sound, I reeled away and shambled hurriedly down the street, home to Nan. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Next stop, Nowhere, by Dick Purcell. Originally published in Imagination Stories of Science and Fantasy, August 1956. Narrated by Tom Trussel. 4 persons disappearing from an elevator should have caused concern, even excitement, especially when the elevator was stuck between 2 floors. But the thing was handled quite casually, and with good reason. After all, when a thing is not understood, the best defense against acknowledging ignorance is to insist that nothing extraordinary happened. In this case, 4 persons, a girl and 3 men, stepped into an elevator in the Kendall building. They were all headed for the same suite, offices occupied by several medical men. The elevator jammed between the 6th and 7th floors and refused to budge. The operator, a salty little Brooklynite, swore quietly to himself and pushed the emergency signal. It rang, but nothing happened. The operator waited for a few minutes, then spoke in a carefully casual voice. "The blessed engineer is out to supper. Now ain't that the way things always happens? When the blessed engineer goes out to supper, the blessed elevator does a blessed sit-down between 2 floors." What are we going to do?" This from the very pretty female passenger named Peggy Wilson, who was afraid of almost everything and was going to a psychiatrist who was trying to root a dominating mother out of the poor girl's subconscious and put the old lady back in her grave where she belonged. "We aren't in any danger, miss. We could wait for the engineer, but it might be quite a while." "It looks to me as though we'll have to wait for him," Walter Maltby said. Maltby was an ingrown little man who had a toothache for 3 weeks and had finally been driven to the dentist by his dominating wife. "Oh no, if one of you guys, men, will boost me through the trap in the roof of the car, I can get to the 7th floor door. I'll crawl out and go down in the basement and move the blessed car to 7 by hand." "Okay," Wilmer Peyton said. He was a 6'4" Greek god with a body close to perfection and a handsome, intelligent face that was nothing more than a spate of false advertising pasted across the front of a vacant head. Wilmer was pretty much of a mental bankrupt. He didn't even own the furniture in his own cerebral attic, the pieces having been placed there by others. He had the look of a rising young executive and was the assistant mailroom boy in a large publishing company, and a good one too. Lately they had been entrusting him with special delivery letters. He braced himself, and the operator climbed on his shoulders and vanished through the ceiling. A moment later there was a sound of an opening door, and a few grunts and scramblings, after which the door closed, and silence again prevailed. The 3 passengers glanced at each other fearfully. The 4th, a small white-haired man in his late 60s, had stood quietly in one corner during the whole procedure. He had a pair of bright black eyes, and a look remindful of an alert fox terrier in a basement known to house rats. He was Fleming Carter, a psychiatrist by profession, and a student of almost everything by choice. He was an accomplished linguist among other things, and translated Sanskrit and Hebrew for the pleasure of it. He was an amateur chemist, and also conducted himself ably on a pair of skis. So the quartet was not lacking in brilliance, Fleming Carter having enough to burnish all 4. He had mentally taken his 3 fellow prisoners apart and put them together again when he noticed the girl's trembling and saw her first tears. Only then did he step forward. "There is no cause for alarm, my dear, none at all. These lifts fairly bristle with safety devices. The insurance companies demand it." Peggy Wilson turned to him gratefully. A little like a kitten, he thought, which yearned for the reassurance of a soothing hand. She would make a beautiful Persian, he thought. A perfect house pet. But to be trapped here, like animals, Peggy whimpered. "It's terrible." She was moving toward Fleming Carter's shoulder, but Wilmer Peyton took a single step forward, and her head turned quite naturally to his bosom. Fleming Carter smiled, and estimated to a nicety the intelligence of any offspring that would result from a mating of these 2 vacuums. "It's all right, baby," Wilmer said. "I'll take care of you." Walter Maltby had troubles of his own. He now voiced them. "Jenny will be furious if you don't get out of here pretty quick. I'm always home for television theatre, and if I don't make it—" He got no further, because at that moment the foundations of the world seemed to give way, and the four of them were hurled into a heap on the floor. Or were they? This question was in Fleming Carter's mind as Peggy Wilson screamed, Walter Maltby whimpered, and Wilmer Peyton bellowed in terror. Had the lift fallen? The building collapsed? An atom bomb exploded? His instincts told him no. This because, while all the outward manifestations of such catastrophe seemed apparent, there was something strangely different about the sudden chaos into which the group had been thrown. Fleming Carter felt they should all be dead, but they remained very much alive. They should have been at least mangled and maimed. None appeared even scratched. All this, Carter told himself firmly, was a chaos of the mind, and nothing more. It was mental panic of such violence that it was manifesting in the physical. He told himself this while he sought to maintain equilibrium while standing upon nothing, and wondering where such a terrific wind would come from in a sheltered elevator shaft. Then it was over. The hurricane subsided, the floor stiffened beneath them, and they were lying in a heap. A heap made interesting by Peggy Wilson's legs sprawled above the others in a very unladylike manner. Wilmer Peyton groaned. "Shut up," Fleming Carter said sharply. "Don't start a wave of panic and hysteria. You aren't hurt." "How the hell do you know I ain't?" Wilmer Peyton demanded with childlike docility. "Because I'm not, and no one else seems to be, and we're all fell the same distance." Fleming Carter began to extricate himself from the pack. This necessitated pressing rather personally against Peggy Wilson. He did what he had to do, and then drew the girl's skirt down as gently and hastily as possible. He was relieved to find she was in no shape to care what anyone did with her skirt. Meanwhile, the elevator operator, upon finding he could not move the elevator, returned to reassure the occupants. He went to the 7th floor and called down very cheerily, "Everything's all right, folks. If this had happened before 6 o'clock, there'd be plenty of blessed people around, but it's almost 7, and the engineer ain't back from supper yet. Won't be but a little while, though, and then—" The operator became aware that only silence answered him. Had they been scared dumb? "You! Hey you! Down there!" More silence. The operator frowned and crawled down into the shaft. He looked through the trap. Empty. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, and because an obvious situation was covered by an obvious answer, added, "All 4 of them crawled out and went home. Funny they couldn't stick around a few minutes." He did not ponder the difficulties involved in such an escape. The only direction they could have gone was up and out on the 7th floor. He thus accepted the obvious, and his only thought on the subject was that he'd like to have been the one to boost the girl up. Later, he bawled the engineer out, and that was that, as far as he was concerned. But the situation was far less simple for the Fork passengers. As Fleming Carter struggled to his feet, Walter Maltby used his leg for a ladder and became erect also and said, "I'll bet Jenny will sue somebody for this. Jenny won't let them get away with it, not for a minute." Wilmer Peyton was also on his feet, looking dully about him. Fleming Carter said, "Why don't you help the lady, young man? I'm sure she would appreciate the courtesy from you more than myself, or—" He looked questioningly at the other male member of the quartet. "Walter Maltby, and as I was saying, Jenny will never—" "I'm sure she won't." "What happened?" Wilmer Peyton asked of no one in particular as he hauled Peggy Wilson to her feet. The girl was biting her lip, trying hard to be brave. "The elevator must have fallen. It's a wonder we weren't all killed." They agreed. All save Fleming Carter, who was looking around with bright interest. "It seems to me that we are no longer in the elevator." Walter Maltby's jaw dropped. "No longer in the—" "This is a somewhat larger area, and I fail to see any walls. Also, the ceiling seems to have vanished." The other 3 gazed about in shocked silence, and the truth of Fleming Carter's statements dawned on them. No walls, no ceiling, nothing but hard earth under their feet and a high blue sky above. "Why, we're out in the country," Peggy Wilson babbled. "I agree," Fleming Carter said, "but let's not get panicky. We're still alive and unhurt." "But I don't understand it," Walter Maltby said plaintively. "I just don't understand it." Fleming Carter regarded the little man with pity. No Jenny around to reassure the little man with her domineering bulk. Carter knew as a matter of course that Jenny would be both bulky and domineering. Carter looked about him. They were out in open country, that was obvious. There was a huge sun and a huge blue sky and huge clouds floating overhead. Everything in place, but something very wrong. Things were just too big. That was it, Carter told himself. The size of this new world was far out of proportion to the size of him and his new friends. They were all standing in coarse grass that reached their knees. High grass. But Carter realized instantly that the grass was not high. They themselves were short. Wilmer Peyton, holding Peggy Wilson in the crook of one arm, looked about through eyes that obviously sent no intelligence messages to his brain. He turned them on Carter and said, "I don't get any of this." "I think I know what happened," Carter said. This even caught the interest of Walter Maltby, who was wondering what Jenny would have to say about his not arriving home on schedule. "What did happen?" "We've fallen, or were snatched, through some sort of space-time warp." Wilmer Peyton gaped idiotically and said, "We did which? Through a what?" Fleming Carter seemed not to hear. He was staring pensively at the thick blades of grass that brushed his knees. "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio," he mused. "There ain't nobody here named Horatio," Wilmer said suddenly. "Excuse me, my mind was wandering." Carter's mind was not wandering at all, however. He said, "There are certain unexplained phenomena that are believed to have happened in our world. People have been known to disappear mysteriously, and those who remain behind formulate theories as to the how and the why of their vanishing. It is believed by some that people can be moved under certain conditions from one plane of existence to another, that there are many of these so-called planes of existence where many and varied peoples live and breathe upon them. Of course, no proof has ever been found for these theories, because the vanished persons never came back to testify. But—" Carter stopped suddenly and regarded the three with a touch of compassion. "You haven't the least idea what I'm talking about, do you?" "I'm afraid not," Walter Maltby said timidly. "Well, never mind. Perhaps I don't either. In any case, existence is its own excuse for accepting any locale. Suffice it to say, we are now in a world that has not built for us, a world for creatures of far greater dimensions than ourselves, and how we got here is really of little importance." Peggy Wilson was now snugly in Wilmer Peyton's arms, her head tight against his chest. Wilmer was just opening his mouth to say something when, over the slope of the land, a huge form appeared. There was nothing mystifying about it. The creature was obviously a man. He wore rather strange, loose clothing that, Carter thought, had some resemblance to those of the ancient Greeks, but otherwise there was nothing different about him except his size. As he approached, Fleming Carter estimated that Wilmer Peyton, the tallest of the four, would come about to the top of this odd sandal-like footgear. There was no panic now, the three being completely frozen with terror, and Carter statue quiet and sharply alert. The giant, he was sure, would pass within 200 yards of them, a distance dangerously close considering the man's size. Still, Carter was optimistic. There was no reason why the giant should see them. As things were, they would certainly hope to be overlooked. But Peggy Wilson dashed this hope as the pressure within her became too strong to contain and broke out in the form of a scream. The giant stopped, took a few quick steps in their direction, and was upon them. Carter knew then that they were lost. A huge hand swooped down and lifted Walter Maltby into the air. Far above, Carter saw the terrified Maltby being transferred carefully to the giant's other hand. Now Wilma Peyton and Peggy Wilson were running blindly in two directions, Peggy having been suddenly deserted by her protector. Twice more the huge hand descended, and the two also vanished into the vast palm. Apparently the giant overlooked Fleming Carter, who had stood quite still during the whole time. But Carter made a swift decision based more on charity than good sense. Somehow he could not leave those three to their fate, so he cried out and waved his arms. "Just a moment! You overlooked me!" The hand swooped down again as the giant saw him. Carter Fleming found himself resting comfortably with his face against someone's back. Otherwise, he was completely surrounded by soft flesh. He realized they were being handled carefully, however, so he felt that death, while definitely a threat, had been at least postponed. He wondered about the others, so close to him, and yet so far away, so far as contact was concerned. He knew the terror that raced through their minds, and he pitied them. The giant was continuing on, Carter decided, and he endured the ride as best he could. Then it terminated suddenly, as Carter and the others were very gently tumbled into a room. The room had no ceiling, but this situation was speedily remedied when a seedling was lowered and set into place above them. In the resulting darkness, Carter heard Peggy Wilson sobbing and various unintelligible noises from Maltby and Peyton. Then the room began suddenly to move in haphazard directions. Possibly this was finally the end, but Fleming Carter could not bring himself to think so. Because even though the room pitched and tossed, Carter felt it was being done rather gently by the giant hands. Then it was over. The room settled down and remained on solid base. Immediately there was a rending sound, and a vast finger was thrust through the wall just below ceiling level. The finger was withdrawn, but only to reappear when thrust through the other side. It vanished again, and the two resulting holes let in ample air and light. For a few moments Carter and the others sat motionless, waiting. Something was going on outside the room itself moving slightly, but the violent tossing was evidently over. Peggy Wilson spoke first, or rather sobbed, "Where are we?" "I'm sure I don't know, my dear, but if I stood on the young man's shoulders I could look out through one of those openings and perhaps learn a little something." "You want me to lift you?" Wilma Peyton said dully. "That is the general idea," Carter replied in a gentle voice. Wilma braced himself against the wall, and Carter clambered to his shoulders and cautiously pushed his head through the opening. He remained thus for quite a while, until Wilma Peyton began moving restlessly. Then he clambered down. They waited for him to speak, but he said nothing. He stared at the hole with a look of amazement upon his face, as though, for the first time, the wonder of this strange transition had struck him forcibly. Then he turned his eyes upon his three companions, and there was a look in his eyes that had not been there before. Personal, yet impersonally analytical. A hard look to read, so he could have no way of knowing that he was trying to forecast how they would react to the fate that awaited them. "Well," Wilma Peyton demanded impatiently, "did you see anything?" "Yes, this is not a room. It is a huge box of some sort. It is bound around on all sides by what looks like red carpeting out of width used in hallways. I believe such carpetings are called runners. Attached to the top is a large white sail, although it appears to be made of paper rather than canvas. He was watching them closely as he spoke. "It took you all that time to see those things?" Walter Maltby asked a trifle plaintively. "No, there were other things." At this point, Peggy Wilson, coming out of her shock, began to cry hysterically. "My God, what's to become of us? We'll all be killed, murdered." "I don't think so," Carter said. "Then we'll be held prisoner. That will be just as bad." "In a sense, you will be held prisoner, but I don't think it will be bad. I think our jailer will probably be a rather kindly person who will give us every consideration." "How could a jailer do that?" Peggy Wilson moaned. Carter laid a hand upon her shoulder. "Consider, my dear, all your life you have needed a mother. Now you will have the equivalent of one." He turned to Walter Maltby. "And you have learned to function only as a result of a dominating wife's promptings. Our jailer will fill that role for you." Lastly, he regarded Wilmer Peyton. "You, young man, will be directed and guided. You will not have need of the brain power with which you are not equipped. All of you will be content. None will have any decisions to make. All will be taken care of. Can you think of a more pleasant destiny?" Walter Maltby said, "You're talking in circles, talking but not saying anything." Carter had turned away, smiling. "This is very strange. We were transported to another plane, but not snatched up willy-nilly. There was a pattern behind it. 3 people admirably suited to their new fate." Wilmer Peyton seized Fleming Carter by the arm and whirled him around. "Will you please tell us what you're talking about?" "Of course," Carter said quietly. "To speak the absolute truth, we are in a box. The box is tied with a wide red ribbon. The thing I called a sail is in reality a greeting card upon which certain words are written, words not too difficult to decipher." "Well, go on. What are the words?" "In English, they would read, 'Happy birthday, darling. You are someone's birthday present.'" Peggy's face was ashen. "You speak of us," she whispered. "How well suited we are for this fate. What about yourself?" Carter smiled. "I expect this to be the most interesting period of my life," he said. "You see, the present is for me. I picked it out." And as they watched in stunned amazement, Carter began to grow. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Firegod by Algis Budrys, writing as William Scarf. Originally published in Rocket Stories, July 1953. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Your Majesty, the High Mersu, Emperor of all the suns, Protector of the galaxy, looked up calmly as its Prime Minister burst into the room. His lean, brooding face did not change expression as he watched the pale and perspiring man cross the flagstoned floor with a sharp, nervous patter of leather. "Gently, Tors, gently," he said quietly, his eyes mocking under their overhang of dark eyebrow. "You're Prime Minister now. Remember that. A Prime Minister doesn't come blundering into the palace looking as though the sky was falling. It creates unrest in the population. Try to remember that we're no longer a pair of obscure rabble-rousers trying to overthrow the crown. We are the crown now. Try to act like it." "Dahai, the sky is falling!" Tors burst out unheedingly. "I have word that the Earthmen are driving beyond the rim and into the heart of the Empire itself. Their ships are irresistible. They're winning battle after battle, and the people are restless. They say it's time the false emperor's rule was overthrown. Some of the garrisons are rebelling." Still the emperor's expression did not change. "So," he said calmly, "the Earthmen were not bluffing when they said they'd maintain the rights of the old emperor." "Yes, you said they wouldn't die. What are we going to do?" "I was wrong, Tors," Mersu said evenly. "No matter. As for what we are going to do, why, I suppose you'd better arrange for another broadcast. Tell the people we have weapons ready if the situation becomes serious, that they have nothing to fear." "But the situation is serious. And what weapons?" "No weapons, Tors," Mersu explained patiently. "But the story will serve to keep the people calm, and perhaps make them think twice about revolt. Now go. Hurry." The Prime Minister's feet pattered over the floor again. The door to the room closed. Mersu smiled quietly. He rose and opened the concealed door behind his chair. Closing it behind him, he slipped into a passage of which no one knew, and 10 minutes later he was in a private tubeway that led halfway across the continent into the heart of an old and barren mountain range. As he sat comfortably in the padded upholstery of the tube car, Mersu smiled again. Poor Tors, so excitable, always the hysteric, a perfect rabble-rouser perhaps, but not a clever man. No, never a clever man. A clever man knew when the game was over, and Mersu laughed. The game had been worth it. 5 years ago he had been a revolutionary, slinking through the alleys at night, always in danger, and always clever. 4 years of that, and then empire. Absolute rule over the entire Greater Magellanic Cloud. Now he was once again in danger. But it was a danger he had long ago foreseen and planned for. And the past year had been worth it. He laughed again. Poor addle-witted Tors, left with the empty bag in his hands. The spaceship rested like a crouching bullet in its chamber. As he slid the tubeway door shut behind him, Mersu admired the savage sleekness of its lines once again. Even more, he admired his cleverness in having it built. A clever man always has a back door. He crossed the hangar floor unhurriedly and climbed into the ship. The control room was small but efficient. 100 controls lay closely around the padded chair, some of them for the standard drive, others for the hyperspatial warp. The hyperspatial warp. Mersu smiled. There was his escape. And more. Here were the means for his future rulership over nothing so small as the cloud. Here were entire galaxies waiting for his hand. Hyperspace. There was something to make a man think. Another universe, not beyond, but alongside his own, hidden in the complex byways of Riemannian geometry and the mathematics of Einstein. A universe where time itself ran slower, where a year of normal time encompassed centuries. A ship could twist itself into that universe and travel just below the speed of light, the limit which, in normal space, was the barrier no ship could cross. But in hyperspace, while the same barrier existed, a man from normal space could travel for centuries, covering great distances, while for him only a few months passed. Mersu chuckled. Behind him, stored in the great holds of the ship, were working models of every machine and weapon the cloud civilization possessed. There were plans, manuals, instructions, all translated into basic symbology that any intelligent being could understand. Packed into this ship was an entire civilization, ready to be brought to whatever people Mersu chose. He had only to enter hyperspace and lose himself where no Earthman or rebel could follow. And there he would find a primitive race barely beginning to rise out of the mud. He would bring them civilization. In return, he would have godhood. They would worship him, those primitive people. He would be Mersu, the Firegod, thundering out of the sky, bringing with him the gift of civilization. And once the gift was given, he would climb back into the sky on a pillar of fire, promising to return when his people were ready. He laughed aloud, the deep bass sound echoing through the control chamber. Why not? He could fly back into space and spend a year waiting, while centuries passed on the primitive world. When he returned, that world would be his, and soon afterward the entire universe would bow before the name of Mersu, the immortal Firegod, for there is no force so strong, no loyalty so great, as that of men for their gods. Still laughing, he blasted the ship out of its hangar into the darkness of space, and a little later into hyperspace, while the big blue ships of Earth smashed his discarded empire behind him. In a month, he had found his planet and his people. They were almost human in appearance, but shorter. So much the better. He was like them, but just different enough to be a god. He brought his ship roaring down through the atmosphere, trailing a streamer of flame. As he passed over the sea that covered most of the world, the wash of his jets kicked the water into froth, and the sound of his passage echoed through the sky. The village rested on the shore of the sea. The mud huts trembled as his ship sank down, resting on its jet stream until it settled slowly to the ground. Smiling faintly, Mersu put on his spacesuit, strapping his anti-gravity harness on over it. He flew out over his upper airlock, carrying a gun in his hand. He hovered in the air above the village. He pointed the gun into the air and fired. A cone of flame shot toward the sky. He pointed the gun at the sea, and towering curtains of steam rose to hang over the village. Mersu descended, and found his people grovelling in the mud. Weeks passed. A stream of men carried the ship's cargo into a great sprawling building that Mersu carved out of a stone cliff with a summer-topic cutter. The lintels of the building were sanctified with the blood of virgins. A new class of people arose in the village, the priests of Mersu, the fire god. And as the ship rose up into space again, on its journey back into the normal space where Mersu would wait his year and the centuries would pass for his people, the priests chanted over their altars. "He will return. Mersu goes to his kingdom in the sky, but he will return bearing flame in his hands. Mersu, the fire god, Mersu, the immortal bringer of fire, will return." And the centuries passed. Mersu brought his ship out of the sky, tearing the air as he came, the growl of his jets thundering over the mighty city on the sea. The sound echoed back from the carved face of the temple of Mersu, and beat against the spreading buildings. The ship settled to earth. Mersu strapped on his antigrav unit, and flashed out into the air above the city. He fired his gun into the sea, and the steam curtain rose once more. He pointed the gun skyward, and the heavens danced with flame. A low, snarling car bearing the sign of Mersu's priesthood drove up to him as he touched the ground. 2 men got out and walked toward him, one of them dressed in the sombre black of the priesthood. Mersu stood waiting, his eyes lighting with triumphant fire. "Who are you?" the priest asked. Mersu stared, the pose broken. "Who am I? Kneel, fool! I am Mersu, the Firegod." The two men looked at him speechlessly for a moment, then burst into laughter. "Mersu!" The priest wiped his eyes. The other man's laughter trailed into anger. "Watch your tongue, blasphemer!" he said curtly, drawing a gun from its holster. "Mersu," the priest repeated. "You're the fool, stranger. At least the others who tried to claim his godhood had the sense to disguise themselves to resemble his pictures." "Pictures change, rash priest," Mersu thundered. "I am the Firegod. Look on my power." Once more he fired into the sea, and once more the steam pillars rose. "I am the god of fire. I fly in the hands of flame. I walk on the air. I burn the land and the sea. I am Mersu." The priest's face lost its tolerant amusement. His mouth twisted in scorn. "Walk on the air, do you? In a Mark 11 antigrav belt, yes. Burn sea and land, eh? With the sun guns, certainly. Fly in the hands of flame? If you wish to be picturesque about it, yes. But so does every drunken fool of a spaceman." "I tell you I am Mersu!" Mersu screamed. "Bow down and worship!" "Silence!" The priest's voice was dangerous. "You will come with us to the temple. There you'll see how we worship impostors." "I'll kill you!" Mersu shouted, raising his gun. The priest motioned with his hand. The man with him blew Mersu's head off. "Blasphemer!" The priest spat disdainfully, his voice filled with disgust. He and his retainer turned back to the car, leaving the body to be carted away later. Every evening at sunset, the priests of Mersu stand over their altars and intone the words, "He will return, Mersu the Firegod. Mersu, the immortal bringer of fire, will return." And the people of Mersu's world intone in reply, "He will return." Throughout the galaxies of hyperspace, wherever the men of Mersu's world may wander, there are other priests and other races that respond, but the ritual is always the same. He will return. And the city waits, the planet waits, and the other planets about the other stars through all the galaxies of hyperspace wait. They always will. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Even Stephen by Charles A. Stearns. Originally published in Infinity, July 1957. Narrated by Tom Trussel. The henna-haired young man with a vermilion cape boarded Stephen's vehicle on the 33rd air level, less than 2 whoops and a holler from a stationary police float, by the simple expedient of grappling them together with his right arm, climbing over into the seat beside Stephen, and allowing his own skimmer car to whisk off at 1,000 miles an hour with no more control than its traffic-dodging mechanism afforded. The peregrinator was barbarically splendid, and his curls showed the effect of habitual use of some good hair undulant. More to the point, he had a gun. It was one of those wicked moisture rifles which can steam the flesh off a man's bones at 300 paces. Quite illegal. He smiled at Stephen. His dentures were good. They were stainless steel, but in this day and time that was to be expected. Most of his generation, in embryo during the last blowdown, had been born without teeth of their own. "Sorry to inconvenience you, citizen," he said, "but the police were right on my brush that time. Please turn right at the next air corridor and head out to sea." And when Stephen, entranced, showed no inclination to obey, he prodded him with a weapon. Prodded him in a most sensitive part of his anatomy. "I have already killed once today," he said, "and it is not yet 11 o'clock. "I see," Stephen said stiffly, and changed course. He might simply have exceeded the speed limit in the slow traffic stream and gotten them arrested, but he sensed that this would not do. A half-memory playing around in his cranium cried out for recognition. Somewhere he had seen this deadly young man before, and with him there was associated a more than vague unpleasantness. Soon the blue Pacific was under them. They were streaming southwest by south at an altitude of 80 miles. Stephen was not terrified at being kidnapped, for he had never heard of such a thing. But there was one thing that did worry him. "I shall be late for work," he said. "Work," the young man said, "is a bore." Stephen was shocked. Work had always been the sacred principle of his life, a rare and elevating sweetness to be cultivated and savoured whenever it might be offered. He himself had long been allotted alternate Thursday afternoons as biological technician at Nanotic Manufacturers, plant number 103, by the Works Administration, and he had not missed a day for many years. This happened to be one of his Thursdays, and if he did not arrive soon, he would be late for the 4-hour shift. Certainly no one else could be expected to relinquish a part of his shift to accommodate a laggard. "Work is for prats," the young man said again. "It encourages steatopygia. My last work date was 9 years ago, and I'm glad that I never went back." Stephen now felt a surge of fear at last. Such unregenerates as this man were said to exist, but he had never met one before. They were the shadowy unemployed, who, barred from government dispensation, must live by their wits alone. Whimsical nihilists, they, who are apt to requisition human life, as well as property, at a breath's notice. Small lightning sheeted in front of their bow. A voice crackled in the communications disk. "Attention! This is an official air barricade. Proceed to level 12 to be cleared." "Pretend to comply," the young man said. "Then, when you are 6 or 8 levels below those patrol skimmers following us, make a run for it toward that cloud bank on the horizon." "Very well," Stephen said. He had quickly weighed the gloomy possibilities, and decided that his best chance for survival lay in instant compliance with this madman's wishes, however outrageous they might seem. He nosed down, silently flitting past brightly painted fueling blimp platforms and directional floats with their winking beacons. To the east, the city lay, with its waffle-like subdivisions, its height-foreshortened skyscrapers, and its vast port, where space rockets winked upward every few minutes. "If you were only on one of those," Stephen said feelingly. His abductor smiled, a rather malicious smile. "Who wants to go to Mars?" he said. "Earth is such a fascinating place. Why leave it? After all, only here, upon this exquisitely green, clean sphere of ours, can the full richness of man's endeavours be enjoyed. And you would have me abandon it all." "I was only thinking aloud," Stephen said. The smile withered. "Mind your altitude," the young man said, "and try no tricks." 20 seconds had passed. 35. "Now." Tight-lipped, Stephen nodded, levelled off, and energized the plates with a full formidable power. They shot past the police stationary and into the great azure curve of the horizon at a pace which would have left Stephen breathless at any other time. There came a sputter of ether-born voices. The henna-haired young man turned off the receiver. In an instant there were skimmers in hot pursuit, but the cloud bank loomed close, towering and opaque. Now the wisps of white were about them, and a curious, acrid smell filtered in through the aerating system. The odour of ozone. The skimmer began to shudder violently, tossing them about in their seats. "I've never experienced such turbulence," Stephen exclaimed. "I believe this is no ordinary cloud." "You are right," the henna-haired young man said. "This is sanctuary." "Who are you?" Stephen said. "Why are you running from the police?" "Apparently you don't read the newspapers." "I keep abreast of the advances in technology and philosophy. I meant the tabloid news. There is such a page, you know, in the back of every newspaper. No, I perceive that you never would allow yourself to become interested in such plebeian goings-on. Therefore, let me introduce myself. I am called Turpin." "The bedchamber assassin! I knew that I'd seen your face somewhere." "So you do sneak and read the scandals like most of your mechanics cast. To think that you secretly admire us, who live upon the brink, and save a life while it lasts." "I could hardly admire you. You are credited with killing 12 women." Stephen shuddered. Turpin inclined his handsome head sardonically. "Such is the artistic license of the press. Actually, there was only 9. Until this morning, I regret to say. And one of those died in the ecstasy of awakening to find me hovering over her virginal bed. I suppose she had a weak heart. I kill only when it's unavoidable. But so long as my lady will wear jewels and keep them on her boudoir dressing-table," he shrugged, "naturally, I'm sometimes interrupted." "And then you murder them." "Let's say I make them a sporting proposition. I am not bad to look upon. I think you will admit that fact. Unless they happen to be hysterical to begin with, I can invariably dominate them. Face the facts, my stodgy technician. Murder is a term for equals. A woman is a lesser, though a fascinating creature. The law of humane grace does not apply equally to her. It must be a humiliating thing to be a woman, and yet it is necessary that a supply of them be provided. Must we who are fortunate in our male superiority deny our natures to keep from trampling them occasionally? No, indeed. Sensualists are they. A trouble and a terror is the hero to them. Thus spake Zarathustra." "That is a quotation from an ancient provincial who was said to be as mad as you are," Stephen said, rallying slightly, but revising his opinion on the uncouthness of his captor. "I have studied the old books," Turpin said. "They are mostly pap, but once I thought that the answers might be discovered there. You may set down now." "But we must be miles from any land." "Take a look," Turpin said. And Stephen looked down through the clearing mists and beheld an island. "It happens to be a very special island," Turpin said. "The jurisdiction of no policeman extends here." "Fantastic! What's it called?" "I should imagine that I will call it Utopia 14, or New Valhalla. Idealists seldom possess one iota of originality. This is the same sort of experiment that has been attempted without success from times immemorial. A group of visionaries get together, wangle a charter from some indulgent government, and found a sovereign colony in splendid isolation, and invariably based upon impossible ideas of anarchism." The skimmer car shook itself like a wet terrier, dropped 300 feet in a downdraft, recovered, and glided into a landing as gently as a nesting seabird. They were upon a verdant meadow. Stephen looked around. "One could hardly call this splendid isolation," he remarked. "We're less than 5 minutes from the city, and I'm sure that you'll be reasonable enough to release me now that I've brought you here and allow me to return. I promise not to report this episode." "Magnanimous of you," Turpin said, "but I'm afraid that what you ask is impossible." Then you refuse to let me go? No, no. I merely point out that the cloud through which we arrived at this island was not, as you noted, a natural one. It had the ominous look of a Moline field in the making. In other words, a space distortion barrier the size of which Earth has never seen. And Stephen, looking around them, saw that the cloud had indeed dispersed, and that in its place a vast curtain of shifting, rippling light had arisen, extending upward beyond sight and imagination, to the left and to the right, all around the circle of the horizon, shutting them in, shutting the rest of the universe out. Impenetrable, indestructible. You knew of this, Stephen accused. That's why you brought me here. I admit that there were rumours that such a project might be attempted today. The underworld has ears, Turpin said. That we arrived just in time, however, was merely a circumstance, and even you, my stolid friend, must admit the beauty of the aurora of a Moline field. We are lost, Stephen said, feeling stricken. A distortion barrier endures forever. Faugh, the bedchamber assassin replied. We have a green island for ourselves, which is much better, you'll agree, than being executed. And let me tell you, there are many security officials who ache to pump my twitching body full of the official but deadly muscarine. Besides, there is a colony here, men and women. I intend to thrive. But what of me? Stephen wanted to cry out. I have committed no crime, and I shall be lost away from my books and my work. However, he pulled himself together and noted pedantically that the generation of a Moline field was a capital offence anyway. This afforded little comfort, in that once a group of people have surrounded themselves with a Moline field, they are quite independent, as Turpin had observed, of the law. When they had withdrawn a few yards from the skimmer car, Turpin sighted upon it with a moisture rifle, and the plastic hull melted and ran down in a mass of smoking lava. The past is past, Turpin said, and better done with. Come, let us seek out our new friends. There were men and there were women, clamorously cheerful at their work, unloading an ancient and rickety ferrycopter in the Surprise Valley below the cliffs upon which Stephen and Turpin stood. Stephen, perspiring for the first time in his life, was almost caught up in their enthusiasm as he watched that fairy village of plastitents unfold, shining and shimmering in the reflected hues of the Moline aurora. When Turpin had satisfied himself there were no danger, they descended, scrambling down over rough, shaly and precipitous outcroppings that presented no problem for Stephen, but to which Turpin, oddly enough, clung with the desperation of an acrophobe as he lowered himself gingerly from crag to crag. This slightly built young man, who had seemed nerveless in the sky. Turpin was out of his métier. A man looked up and saw them. He shouted and waved his arms in welcome. Turpin laughed, thinking, perhaps, that the welcome would have been less warm had his identity been known here. The man climbed part way up the slope to meet them. He was youthful in appearance, with dark hair and quick, penetrating eyes. "I'm the planner of Flight 1, he said. "Are you from 3? "We are not," Turpin said. "Flight 2, then." Turpin, smiling like a basilisk, affected to move his head from side to side. And the planner looked alarmed. "Then you must be the police," he said, "for we are only 3 groups. But you are too late to stop our secession, sir. The Moline barrier exists. Let the technocracy legislate against us until it is blue in the face. And there are 312 of us here, against the 2 of you." "Sporting odds," Turpin said. "However, we are merely humble heretics, like yourselves, seeking asylum." "Yes, indeed. Quite by accident, my friend and I wandered into your little ovum universe as it was forming, and here we are, trapped, as it would seem." The crass, brazen liar. The planner was silent for a moment. "It is unlikely that you would happen upon us by chance at such a time," he said at last. "However, you shall have asylum. We could destroy you, but our charter expressly forbids it. We hold human life, even of the basest sort, to be sacred." "Oh, sacred, quite," Turban said. "There is only one condition of your freedom here. There are 156 males among us in our 3 encampments, and exactly the same number of females. The system of numerical pairing was planned for the obvious reason of physical need, and to avoid trouble later on." "A veritable ideal." "It might have been. We are all young after all, and unmarried. Each of us is a theoretical scientist in his or her own right, with a high hereditary intelligence factor. We hope to propagate a superior race of limited numbers for our purpose, ultimate knowledge. Naturally, a freedom in the choice of a mate will be allowed, whenever possible, but both of you, as outsiders, must agree to live out the rest of your natural lives as celibates." Turpin turned to Stephen with a glint of humour in his spectacular eyes. "Celibacy has a tasteless ring to it," he said. "Don't you think so?" "I can only speak for myself," Stephen replied coldly. "We have nothing in common. But for you, I should still be in my world. Considering that we are intruders, however, the offer seems generous enough. Perhaps I shall be given some kind of work. That is enough to live for." "What is your field?" the planner asked Stephen. "I am, or was, a biological technician." "That is unfortunate," the planner said with a sudden chill in his voice. "You see, we came here to get away from the technicians." "I," said Turpin haughtily, "was a burglar. However, I think I see the shape of my new vocation forming at this instant. I see no weapons among your colonists." "They are forbidden here," the planner said. "I observe that you have a moisture rifle. You will be required to turn it over to us to be destroyed." Turpin chuckled. "Now you are being silly," he said. "If you have no weapons, it must have occurred to you that you cannot effectively forbid me mine." "You cannot stand alone against 300. "Of course I can," Turpin said. "You know quite well that if you try to overpower me, scores of you will die. What would happen to your vaunted sexual balance then? No, indeed. I think you will admit to the only practical solution, which is that I take over the government of the island." The officiousness and the élan seemed to go out of the planner at once, like the air out of a pricked balloon. He was suddenly an old young man. Stephen saw, with a sinking feeling, that the audacity of Turpin had triumphed again. "You have the advantage of me at the moment," the planner said. "I relinquish my authority to you in order to avoid bloodshed. Henceforth, you will be our planner. Time will judge my action. And yours." "Not your planner," Turpin said. "Your dictator." There could be but one end to it, of course. One of the first official actions of Dictator Turpin, from the eminence of his lofty translucent tent with its red and yellow flag on top, was to decree a social festival, to which the other 2 settlements were invited for eating, drinking, and fraternization unrestrained. How unrestrained, no one, unless Turpin, could have predicted until late that evening, when the aspect of it began to be bacchanalian, with the mores and the inhibitions of these intellectuals stripped off, one by one, like the garments of civilization. Stephen was shocked. Secretly had approved, at least, of the ideals of these rebels. But what hope could there be if they could so easily fall under the domination of Turpin? Still, there was something insidiously compelling about the man. As for Stephen, he had been allotted his position in his new life, and he was not flattered.
You shall be my body servant, Turpin had said. I can more nearly trust you than anyone else, since your life, as well as mine, hangs in the balance of my ascendance. I would betray you at the earliest opportunity. Turpin laughed. I'm sure that you would. But you value your life, and you will be careful. Here with me you are safer from intrigue. Later I shall find confidence and kindred spirits here, no doubt, who will help me to consolidate my power. They will rise and destroy you before that time. You must eventually sleep. I sleep as lightly as a cat. Besides, so long as they are inflamed, as they are tonight, with one another, they are not apt to become inflamed against me. For every male there is a female. Not all of them will pair tonight, nor even in a week, and by the time this obsession fails to claim their attention, I shall be firmly seated upon my throne. There will be no women left for you or me, of course, but you will have your work, as you noted, and it will consist of keeping my boots shined and my clothing pressed. And you, Stephen said bitterly. Ah, yes, what of the dictator? I have a confession to make to you, my familiar. I prefer it this way. If I should simply choose a woman, there would be no zest to it. Therefore, I shall wait until they're all taken, and then I shall steal one. Each week. Now go out and enjoy yourself. Stephen, steeped in gloom, left the tent. No one paid any attention to him. There was a good deal of screaming and laughing. Too much screaming. He walked along the avenue of tents. Beyond the temporary floodlights of the atomic generators it was quite dark. Yet around the horizon played the flickering lights of the aurora, higher now that the sun was beyond the sea. 1,000 years from now it would be there, visible each night, as common to that distant generation as starlight. From the shadow of the valley's rim he emerged upon a low promontory above the village. Directly below where he stood, a woman, shrieking, ran into the blackness of a grove of small trees. She was pursued by a man, and then she was pursued no more. He turned away, toward the seashore. It lay 1/2 mile beyond the settlement of Flight 1. Presently he came upon a sandy beach. The sea was dark and calm. There was never any wind here. Aloft the barrier arose more plainly than before, touching the ocean, perhaps 1/2 mile from shore, but invisible at sea level. And beyond it, he stared. There were the lights of a great city shining across the water. The lights twinkled like jewels, beckoning nostalgically to him. But then he remembered that a Moline field, jealously allowing only the passage of photonic energy, was said to have a prismatic effect, and yet another, a nameless and inexplicable impress upon light itself. The lights were a mirage. Perhaps they existed 1,000 miles away, perhaps not at all. He shivered. And then he saw the object in the water, bobbing out there 100 yards from the beach. Something white, an arm upraised. It was a human being swimming toward him, and helplessly arm-weary by the looks of that desperate notion. It disappeared, appeared again, struggling more weakly. Stephen plunged into the water, waded as far as he could, and swam the last 50 feet with a clumsy, unpractised stroke, just in time to grasp the swimmer's hair. And then he saw that the swimmer, going down for the last time, was a girl. They rested upon the warm white sand until she had recovered from her ordeal. Stephen prudently refrained from asking questions. He knew that she belonged to Flight 2 or Flight 3, for he had seen her once or twice before this evening at the festival. Her short platinum curls made her stand out in a crowd. She was not beautiful, and yet there was an essence of her being that appealed strongly to him. Perhaps it was a lingering impression of a soft-tanned body in his arms as he had carried her to shore. "You must have guessed that I was running away," she said presently. "Running away? But how? Where?" "I know. But I had panicked, you see. I was already dreadfully homesick, and then came this horrid festival. I couldn't bear seeing us make such fools of ourselves. The women, well, it was as if we had reverted to animals. One of the men, I think he was a conjectural physicist by the name of Hessen, made advances to me. I'm no formalist, but I ran. Can you understand that?"
"I also disapprove of debauchery," Stearns said.
"I ran and ran until I came at last to this beach. I saw the lights of a city across the water. I am a strong swimmer, and I struck out without stopping to reconsider. It was a horrible experience."
"You found nothing?"
"Nothing, and worse than nothing. There is a place out there where heaven and hell, as well as the earth and the sky, are suspended. I suddenly found myself in a half-world where all directions seemed to lead straight down. I felt myself slipping, sliding, flowing downward, and once I thought I saw a face, an impossible face. Then I was expelled and found myself back in normal waters. I started to swim back here."
"You were very brave to survive such an ordeal," he said. "Would that I had been half so courageous when I first set eyes upon that devil, Turpin. I might have spared all of you this humiliation."
"Then you are the technician who came with Turpin?"
He nodded. "I was, and am, his prisoner. I have more cause to hate him than any of you."
"In that case I shall tell you a secret. The capitulation of our camps to Turpin's tyranny was planned. If you had counted us, you would have found that many of the men stayed away from the festival tonight. They are preparing a surprise attack upon Turpin from behind the village when the celebration reaches its height, and he will expect it least. I heard them making plans for a coup this afternoon."
"It is ill-advised. Many of your men will die, and perhaps for nothing. Turpin is too cunning to be caught napping."
"You could be of help to them," she said.
He shrugged. "I am only a technician, remember? The hated ruling class of the technocracy that you left. A supernumerary, even as Turpin. I cannot help myself to a place in your exclusive society by helping you. Come along, we had better be getting back."
"Where are we going?"
"Straight to Turpin," he said.
"I cannot believe that you would tell me this," Turpin said, striding back and forth, lion-like, before the door of his tent. "Why have you?"
"Because, as you observed, my fate is bound with yours," Stearns said. "Besides, I do not care to be a party to a massacre."
"It will give me great pleasure to massacre them."
"Nevertheless, their clubs and stones will eventually find their marks. Our minutes are numbered unless you yield." Turpin's eyes glowed with the fires of his inner excitement.
"I will never do that," he said. "I think I like this feeling of urgency. What a pity that you cannot learn to savour these supreme moments."
"Then at least let this woman go. She has no part in it." Turpin allowed his eyes to run over the figure of the girl, standing like a petulant naiad, with lowered eyes and trembling lip, and found that figure, in its damp and scanty attire, gratifying. "What is your name?"
"Ellen," she said.
"You will do," Turpin said. "Yes, you will do very well for a hostage." "You forget that these men are true idealists," Stearns said. "Yesterday they may have believed in the sanctity of human life. Today they believe they will be sanctified by spilling their own blood, and they are not particular whether that blood is male or female. If you would survive, it will be necessary for us to retrench."
"What is your suggestion, technician?" I know a place where we can defend ourselves against any attack. There is an elevation not far from here where, if you recall, we stood that first time and spied upon the valley. It is sheer on all sides. We could remain there until daylight, or until you have discouraged this rebellion. It would be impossible for anyone ascending in that loose shale to approach us with stealth." "It is a sound plan," Turpin said. "Gather a few packages of concentrates and sufficient water." "I already have them." "Then take this woman and lead the way. I will follow. And keep in mind that in the event of trouble, both of you will be the first to lose the flesh off your bones from this moisture rifle." Stephen went over and took Ellen by the hand. "Courage," he whispered. "I wish that both of us had drowned," she said. But she came with them docilely enough, and Stephen drew a sigh of relief when they were out of the illuminated area without being discovered. "Walk briskly now," Turpin said, "but do not run. That is something that I have learned in years of skirmishing with the police." At the foot of the cliff, Stephen stopped and removed his shoes. "What are you doing?" Turpin demanded suspiciously. "A precaution against falling," Stephen said. "I prefer to remain fully dressed," Turpin said. "Lead on." Stephen now found that, though the pain was excruciating, his bare feet had rendered him as sure-footed as a goat, while Turpin struggled to keep his footing. Between them the girl uncomplainingly picked her way upward. And then they came to a place, as Stephen had hoped, where it was necessary to scale a sheer scarp of 6 or 7 feet in order to gain a shelf near the summit. He had to kneel in order to help the girl up. Turpin, not tall enough to pull himself up with his arms, cursed as his boots slipped. "Extend the barrel of your rifle to me," Stephen said, "and I will pull you up until you are able to reach that overhanging bush. It will support your weight." Turpin nodded curtly. He was not happy about this. He was never happy when playing a minor role, but he appreciated the urgency of the moment. Stephen pulled, and the bedchamber assassin strained upward. Then he grasped at the bush, and at the same moment Stephen gave a sharp Herculean tug. Turpin snatched for the bush with both hands. "Got it," he said, and swung himself upon the ledge. "Yes," agreed Stephen, "but I have the rifle." Turpin, fettered like a common criminal, lay upon his couch in the tent where he had sat not long ago, a conqueror. The powerful floodlight that shone in his face did nothing to soothe his raw temper. Someone entered the tent, and he strained in his bonds to see who it was. Stephen came and stood over him. Turpin licked his dry lips. "What time is it?" he asked. "It is almost midnight. They have destroyed your rifle, but it has been decided that, in view of your predatory nature, it would be dangerous to release you again upon this colony. Are you prepared to meet your fate?" Turpin sneered. "Destroy me, fool, eunuch! It will not change your lot here. You will remain an untouchable, an odd man out. May your books comfort your cold bed for the rest of your life. I prefer death." Stephen removed the hypodermic needle from the kit which they had furnished him with, and filled it. He bared Turpin's arm. The muscles of that arm were tense, like cords of steel. Turpin was lying. He was frightened of death. Stephen smiled a little. He looked a good deal younger when he smiled. "Please relax," he said. "I am only a biological technician, not an executioner." 2 hours later, Stephen emerged from the tent, perspiring, and found that the revel in the encampment continued unabated even at this time of morning. Few suspected what had been going on in Turpin's tent. These few now anxiously awaited his verdict. "How did it go?" the former planner of Flight 1 asked. "Was the equipment satisfactory?" The drugs in Chalons sufficient? He nodded wearily. The character change appears to have been complete enough. The passivity will grow, of course. A group of men and women were playing a variety of hide-and-seek, with piercing shouts and screams among the shadows of the tents, and it was no child's game. "Don't worry about them," the planner said. "They'll be over it in the morning. Most of them have never had anything to drink before. Our dictator's methods may have been cruder than we intended, but they've certainly broken the ice." "When will we see Turpin?" someone asked. It was Ellen. Stephen had not known what she was waiting. "Any moment now, I believe," he said. "I'll go in and see what is keeping him." He returned in a few seconds. "A matter of clothing," he said with a smile. "I warned you that there would be a complete character change." The garments were supplied. Stephen took them in. The floodlight had been turned off now, and it was fairly dark in the tent. "Hurry up," Stephen said gently. I cannot do it." "Oh, but you can. You can start all over now. Few of the colonists ever knew you by sight. I'm sure that you'll be warmly enough received." Stephen came out. Ellen searched his face. "It will not be much longer now," he told her. "And to think that I doubted you!" "I am only a technician," he said. "There are 162 male high scientists upon this island," she said, coming forward and putting her arms around him. "But only one solid, unimaginative, blessed technician. It makes a nice, even arrangement for us women, don't you think?" "Even enough," he said. And at that moment Turpin stepped out of the tent, and all of them looked, and looked, and Turpin, unable to face that battery of eyes, ran lightly and gracefully through the tent village towards the cliffs beyond, and all along that gauntlet there were catcalls and wolf whistles. "Don't worry," the planner said. "She will come back to us. After all, there is a biological need."
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Go to Sleep, My Darling, by Winston K. Marks. Originally published in Infinity, November 1958. Narrated by Tom Trussel. At 46, Bertrand Baxter was a man's man, still struggling to adapt himself to a smotheringly woman's world. His work, selling sporting goods for Abernathy and Crisp Company, was his element. Not only was he an ex-All-American tackle, but his abiding love for sports had led him into a business where he dealt almost exclusively with men. Old Crisp had once told him, "But if we had 2 more salesmen like you, we could fire the other 20. You have a sixth sense dealing with these coaches and school superintendents. They love you." Yes, Bert Baxter could anticipate his male customers' requirements, objections, moods, and buying habits with an almost clairvoyant insight. But give him a woman. He was licked before she opened his catalogue. Women found him attractive enough. His 6'4", square-jawed athletic prowess had given him the pick of the class of 29, including the statuesque Rolanda. But to marry a woman, and to understand her, were different matters. The former ridiculously easy, the latter bewilderingly impossible. The easy familiarity he enjoyed with men of the slightest acquaintance was something he could never establish in his own home with his own wife and his own daughters. Fate, as if to further confound him, had presented Bertrand with 4 daughters. Of all these females, Rolanda, Aileen, Grace, Norma, and Annie. Only 2-month-old Annie was currently making sense to Bert Baxter. That was because she was a baby, and not yet a female in the baffling sense of the word. His other 3 daughters had had their turns, but as they emerged from infanthood into childhood, they became unmistakable girl children, almost with their first mama-papa lisps, and thereby removed themselves from Baxter's realm of fathomable human beings. He lay sleepless one November night beside the gently snoring Rolanda, debating the wisdom of having induced her to try once more to provide him with a son. Although Rolanda was 40 at the time, Annie had arrived without undue trouble, fitted immediately into the Baxter feminine regime, and established herself in Bert's heart quite solidly, if only temporarily. The misgivings that beset him were vague ones. Annie was the apple of his eye, but in a few short months she would add to the flooding tide of womanhood that swirled through his house, squealing, giggling, moping, hair-curling, nylon rinsing, plucking, powdering, painting, primping, ironing, sweater trading, lipstick snitching, and man-baiting. Too soon. Much too soon. Dear, understandable little Annie would move off in her own miasma of perfume and verbal nonsense, leaving Bertrand once again a lonely man in his crowded home. The illuminated dial said precisely 2 o'clock when a tiny whimper seeped through the adjacent wall from the nursery. Baxter was on the verge of slipping into a doze, but it brought his eyes open. The 2 o'clock feeding. He loved Annie dearly, but it was high time she was omitting the late feeding. It meant rousing Rolanda, who never heard the call. It meant lights and commotion, short tempers, bottle-banging in the kitchen. It meant disturbing the other girls, which occasioned a slipper-shuffling parade to the bathroom with attendant flushing, tap-turning, glass-rattling, and ostentatious whispering that turned the hall into a rustling snake-pit. "Don't wake Daddy. He has to get up early." Indeed, Daddy had to get up early if he hoped to enjoy his shower in peace in the stocking-strewn bathroom. "Go to sleep, Annie," Baxter said in the deep recesses of his mind. "Go to sleep, my darling," he urged gently. "Please don't start the circus. Let me rest. Go to sleep, my darling." Annie's whimper faded, stopped. In the hazy realm between waking and slumber, it didn't seem remarkable to Baxter. Not until he was stuffing his briefcase the following morning did he recall that Annie had at last skipped her late feeding. The memory of his urgent, silent pleading with her came back, and he smiled to himself. If it were only that easy, he thought. He had a strenuous day driving out to a rural school district and rounding up 5 members of the athletic board to complete a nice contract for basketball equipment. He dribbled an Abernathian crisp basketball around the gym 12 times for the coach, lugged 4 sample cases of uniforms up a flight of stairs, and made uncounted round trips to his distantly parked station wagon for afterthought items to satisfy inquiries. But he had energy enough to bowl all evening at the athletic club, of which he was a board director. When he arrived home at 10 o'clock, a bargain in fireplace wood, which Rolanda had purchased from a late peddler, was heaped across the short driveway and had to be tossed into the basement before he could garage the car. He had learned not to question Rolanda's bargains, regardless of the time of day or night they occurred. She welcomed such criticisms as occasions to strike for an increase in the household allowance. "Of course, I wouldn't have to take advantage of these penny savers that you say cause more trouble than they're worth, if we could afford another $5 a week." So he changed clothes, threw in the wood, showered, and sank gratefully into bed. Rolanda was still wiping on cold cream. He asked, "Would you please open the window before you jump in?" "But it's cold out, dear." "It's barely November," he pointed out. "We had that all out last year. Closed windows only during blizzards and high winds." "I know, dear, but summer's just over, and our blood's still thin. Besides, we put on the electric blankets today." Since, theoretically, expensive electric blankets were supposed to add to one's security against chilling, the argument detracted not a whit from Baxter's convictions, but he was too tired to pursue the annual debate about chilling versus fresh air requirements. He inhaled the dense mist of aromatic, warm, humid boudoir essences, and fell into exhausted slumber. His dream was a recurrent one wherein he wandered barefoot through an echoing chamber. He was a Lilliputian, searching the interior of Rolanda's skull, a great, empty, reverberating dome. He had no notion for what he was searching, but all he found were the roots of her yellow hair sticking down through the pate. The edge of his fatigue had just nicely worn off to that treacherous point where to be awakened would result in hours of wakeful tossing, when the whimper came. It came again, and Baxter swam up from the depths until he was half awake. "Sleep, baby," he urged. "Close your eyes and go to sleep, my darling." His lips didn't move, and he was only dreamily aware of the foolish hope that his good luck of last night might be repeated. It worked. Annie quieted, went back to sleep, and stayed asleep until morning. A week later, Rolanda remarked about it at the breakfast table. It did, indeed, seem that Annie had reformed her nocturnal habits. But Baxter knew better. Each night now, at the first whimper, he sent his silent mental message winging through the plaster, lathe, and pink wallpaper to the pink baby under the pink blanket in the pink crib. Annie was still waking at 2 a.m. each night, but she was still complying with his soothing thought appeals. That night, the whimper found him sleepless again. Starkly awake, with eyes wide open, it seemed ridiculous to repeat such a foolish, wishful thinking process, and he refrained from doing so. Telepathy was nonsense. The whimper grew in volume, welled up into a full-throated wail that prickled the short hairs of his neck. "Oh no, Annie, for heaven's sake!" Without thinking further on it, he slipped into his silent pleading. "Go to sleep, baby, go to sleep, my darling." Annie had too much momentum to capitulate easily. He pleaded and cajoled, and finally he mentally hummed 3 stanzas of Rockabye Baby. The wail trembled and fell off into a few reluctant sobs. Annie was comforted, reassured. Annie slept. For all his preoccupation with sports and other manly extroversions, Bertrand Baxter was not unimaginative. His stunning victory on this 7th night was too dramatic to ignore. He said not a word about it to Rolanda, but the following night he deliberately stayed wide awake until Annie sounded off. Instead of immediately flooding his infant daughter with the warm reassurance and pleading requests that she sleep, Baxter let his mind feel of the situation. He spoke softly to her in his unmouthed mind-talk, and for the first time he became aware of a tiny but positive mental response. There was a faint fringe of discomfort thought, a weak hunger pang, a slight thirst, a clammy diaper. But mostly there was the cheerless darkness and a heavy feeling of aloneness, a love want, an outreaching for assurance. As his thoughts went out, he could sense that Annie did receive them and take comfort from them, and the little physical hungers and discomforts faded from her mind. She felt reassured now, loved, petted,
cosy and warm in the velvety gloom, in the restful quiet. He sensed the peace that settled through her, and the same peace flooded through him, a rare sensation of security, understanding, and blind trust. Annie slept. Baxter slept. And then it was Saturday morning. Baxter stayed abed, yielding the bathroom to his 3 teenage daughters. Annie was still asleep, too, so Rolanda was stretching leisurely beside him like a long pink cat. Noticing the time, she raised to an elbow and viewed him with some concern. "No golf this morning? Aren't you well, Bert?" Had he plunged out of bed to forage for his golf shoes as usual, she would have grumbled about it how it must be Saturday, and she wished that she had a whole morning off each week to herself. He replied slowly, "Later, maybe. Want to rest a little bit. Don't stare, I feel fine, just thinking a little." She shrugged, put on her robe, and entered the bathroom competition. Baxter lay waiting, eyes closed, concentrating. Then it came. The sensation of gentle awakening. Light. At first just a diffused pink light, then outlines forming. The ceiling fixture, the yellow-billed ducks on the pale pink wallpaper, the round bars of the crib. The sensation of movement, stretching, a glorious feeling of well-being. Annie was awake. Then, in rapid succession, the sensation of wet diaper, cramped toe, hunger pang, hunger pang! Annie yelled. The sound came through firmly and demandingly, interrupting Baxter's concentration and breaking the remarkable rapport, but he had proved to himself beyond all doubt that he had been dubiously challenging. He had established a clear telepathic entry into his daughter's mind. Now he was so excited that he forgot himself and tried to explain the whole thing to Rolanda. She seemed to listen with half an ear as he assembled breakfast. She didn't understand, or she misunderstood, or she understood but disapproved. Baxter wasn't at all certain which it was. When he finished, she simply paused in her oatmeal dishing, pulled her housecoat tightly about her, and said, "Nonsense. You went back to sleep after I got up. You're dreaming these things. It is high time that Annie began skipping her night feeding." But her eyes were narrowed cat slits, and Baxter felt a positive warning in them. He felt that since creation, probably no man had actually penetrated a woman's brain to probe the willy-nilly logic that functioned there. Functioned well, for somehow things got done, but functioned in such a topsy-turvy manner as to drive a serious male insane if he pondered it too long. He retreated to the morning paper, and said no more about it. Before he left for the golf club, he had another remarkable experience. He stepped into the nursery and stared down at the adorable little pink-cheeked Annie. He closed his eyes and sought her mind, and saw himself standing above the crib, through her eyes. It was clear as a TV image. In fact, he noted that he needed a shave and looked quite strange with his eyes closed. In the days that followed, Baxter became addicted to slipping into Annie's innocent little mind at almost any hour of her waking. At the office, in a customer's waiting room, even out on the golf course while waiting for a slow foursome to tee off ahead. Distance was no obstacle to the telepathic rapport. And he began to make fabulous plans. As Annie grew, he would follow her mental progress, investigating every aspect of her thought processes to learn the key to womankind's inexplicable mind. Through her eyes and other senses, he would experience the woman's world as it impinged upon her, and one day he would fathom the deepest eternal secrets of all womanhood. Whether Rolanda divined his attentions, Baxter never knew, but when Annie was 3 months old, she suddenly began resisting her father's mental intrusion. He first noticed it one evening right after Annie had been tucked in for the night. Baxter was pretending to doze in his leather chair in the den, but actually he had been keeping mental watch until Rolanda cleared out of the nursery. For some reason, he feared communing with Annie while his wife was in the room. Rolanda had come out, down the hall, stopped in the open door of his den, and he had felt her gaze upon him for a long minute. When she passed on without comment, Baxter sought to enter Annie's mind and enjoy her nightly snugged-down feeling of contentment. He probed gently, and to his surprise he met a barrier, an impalpable resistance, a shutting out that he had never encountered. He pressed more firmly. Dim perceptions began to come through to him, but they were dominated by displeasure emotion. Annie cried out. Baxter withdrew instantly, feeling somewhat guilty. Then he tried again. Annie screamed. Rolanda came down the hall, paused at his door, and said, "What do you suppose is the matter with her tonight? She always drops off." Without waiting for an answer, she passed down the hall to the nursery and comforted Annie to sleep. Baxter tried no more that night. It was the same each time he tried thereafter. Abruptly, Annie had become irritable, intolerant of his probing. How she could understand what was happening mystified Baxter, but he was determined to retain contact. He kept pushing, gently but firmly, and although it brought on some furious yells, he succeeded in making at least one daily survey of his infant daughter's mind. For a week, Rolanda became increasingly hostile for no apparent reason. Baxter felt that the tension that grew between them was in some way connected with Annie, but his wife never spoke of it. Never a particularly demonstrative woman, she became even colder, and often he caught her regarding him with an enigmatical look of suspicion. As a long sufferer to her moods, Baxter had no fear that an open break might develop. His life was insured for $75,000, and Rolanda was much too hard-headed to consider divorcing such a solid producer of bread and luxuries as she and her female brood had learned to enjoy. Meanwhile, Annie's mind was becoming an even more fascinating field for exploration. In spite of her resistance, Baxter's shallow penetration revealed the amazing network of learning that daily increased her web of knowledge, experience, and stimulus-response conditioning. Often Baxter pondered what a psychologist would give for such an opportunity as this. He became so bemused with his objective study that the night Annie withdrew her barriers, Baxter's fell into her mind like a lion into a game hunter's animal pit. He was again in his leather chair. Rolanda had just put Annie to bed and passed his open door. He probed for Annie's mind, and leaned the heavy weight of his own strong mind on the expected barrier. It was gone. He sank deeply into his daughter's brain and caught his breath. He had forgotten what it was like, this total absorption with her physical and emotional sensations. Annie was feeling good. Her stomach was full. She was warm, dry, and pleasantly tired from her evening romp. She stretched and yawned, and a feeling of euphoria swept over Baxter. Never had he completed such a transfer. He could feel every little primitive pleasure sensation that rippled through Annie's healthy, growing body. Conversely, 24 trivial but annoying twinges, aches, pains, and bodily pressures that slowly accumulate with the years vanished from his 46-year-old body. The abscessed tooth that he should have had pulled a month ago quit hurting. The ache from the slightly pulled muscle in his back faded away. The pressure from the incipient gastric ulcer in his stomach eased off and disappeared. All the tensions and minor infirmities that had slipped up on him, almost unnoticed with middle age, vanished. and Baxter knew once again the long-forgotten corporeal ecstasy of a young human animal in the rapid growth stages. He awoke to see the fuzzy image of Rolanda over him. It was morning. Her face was faintly troubled, but she smiled with a rare warmth when he cooed at her. She caught him up in her arms, murmuring endearing sounds. Snuggled to her breast, he felt the satisfaction of a great subconscious yearning as the scented woman smell pervaded his nostrils, and her strong, warm arms cuddled him tightly. There was the unpleasant business of a diaper change, during which he became sharply aware of hunger. He yelled lustily for food, and soon he was sucking hungrily on a deliciously flexible rubber nipple that yielded an ambrosia of warm sweetness. A jumble of clear, high voices chirped familiarly in his ears, but he paid no attention to the words as such. His bath was delightful, although he sneezed violently at the talcum dust afterward. Now the voices were silent, except Rolanda's occasional soft words to him. Again he enjoyed his liquid meal, and slipped into delicious slumber with the shades drawn. Voices awakened him. A man's voice mingled with his wife's. "In here, Doctor. We managed to carry him to bed, but he hasn't awakened yet." Baxter heard the words with mild interest, but no comprehension. The man's voice came through the wall of the nursery from the next bedroom, a low rumble of pleasant sound. "No sign of physical impairment. Resembles a catatonic trance. Strange. Heartbeat is rapid, light, respiration too, like a baby's. We'd better take him down to the hospital." "Is it that serious?" "Will be if he continues unconscious. He'll starve." "I'll call the ambulance." Baxter fell asleep again. The chirping voices returned that afternoon, but there was a subdued air about them. For a few days the routine continued. Eating, sleeping, eating, bathing, sleeping, eating. A wondrous kaleidoscopic fairyland of enjoyable sensations. The subdued air disappeared, and the voices chirped loudly and happily around him again. All was pleasant, comfortable, secure. Then one morning his heart beat heavily, awakening him from his nap. His eyelids tore open to a weird sight. Several strange men and women stood around him. They were dressed in white, and he was in a hospital bed. As he traced a rubber tube from its stand-hung bottle done to his arm, a rush of unpleasant sensations, twinges, pains, stiffnesses swarmed back into him. Reluctantly he heard the doctor speak, and he tried to pay no attention. "The adrenaline did it. He's coming around, I think." "No, damn it, he's closing his eyes again. Doesn't seem interested. I thought for a minute." Baxter clenched his eyes tightly and tried to ignore the burning emptiness of his emaciated stomach, the harsh roughness of the hospital sheets against his weak bedsore calves. The drug was fire in his veins, and his heart threatened to jump out of his breast. "Annie, where are you?" A soft, non-verbal little response touched his racked brain, inviting him to return. He concentrated, blocking out the muttering voices around him. Can't keep a man his size alive indefinitely with intravenous. Better phone Mrs. Baxter. Call a priest, too. He made it. He was back in the crib. Rolanda was pulling up the nursery shades, terminating his nap. The phone was ringing. "Be right back, sweetheart," Rolanda said. "Mother has to answer the phone." Her voice came only faintly from the hallway in dull monosyllables. Then she was back, scooping him up in her arms. She sat in a rocker and looked down at him thoughtfully, a serious frown across a wide white brow. "You poor little darling. You'll never know your daddy." For an instant Baxter's consciousness flickered back and forth across miles of intervening space. A cold panic clutched his heart. He heard a sharp sob escape from Annie's lips. Then Rolanda was rocking him and comforting him. "Don't you worry, sweetheart. It's all right. We'll get along. Daddy's insured. And there's his service pension. We'll get along just fine." An intuitive flash of horror chilled Baxter. He struggled to escape to his own brain, his own dying body, but now the barrier was up again. Not impalpable, but tough and impenetrable. The more he struggled, the weaker he became. Sensations from the nursery began to fade, the light grew dimmer, and Rolanda's face became hazy. Frantically, he tried to withdraw from Annie's mind, but he was mouse-trapped. Was this Annie's doing? Was this the vengeance she took against her own father for his invasion of her privacy? Or was it his own mind's refusal to face life again through the network of pain and misery of his adult identity? Infantile regression, the doctor had called it. But the doctor didn't know about Annie. He could still feel the gentle rocking motion and his wife's arms holding him tenderly in the warm blankets. "We'll get along just fine, honey," she was saying. "When we get the insurance money, we'll have a larger house and a new car." "Rolanda, for God's sake, make Annie let me go!" "And you'll have a pretty room all to yourself when you're older. And there's no reason why you can't sleep in my room tonight. Would you like that, honey?" Now the light was dimming fast, but Baxter sensed the glow of pleasure in Annie's tiny body and heard her soft cooing. "Why, Annie," Rolanda's words came from a great distance, "you're smiling, as if you understood every word. Why, you little Dickens!" Annie stiffened suddenly. Then she sighed and gurgled happily, as though she had just gotten something off her mind. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. You know, many of these stories were written in a time where 50 years ago was in the future.